So we are ready to start, and with that, I want to welcome everybody to the Kroc School of Peace Studies. This is a most exciting moment for all of us. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of why I think that is. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with some people from TEDx San Diego, and they want to ask me about what do I think about the future of higher education. And as the dean of the Kroc School, I tend to obsess about things. So for the last, I would say, week and a half, I've been asking everybody, what is the future of higher education? And then I said, oh, come on, Patricia, just be who you are. And I come from a country, Venezuela, where no matter what predictions we have, is everything we think is going to happen doesn't happen. So I refuse to go into this crystal ball kind of prediction style, which I know I'm going to be saying things that don't make any sense or things that are not going to happen, and I'm going to look foolish for those of you who have good memories. So instead, one of the things that I've been thinking is, what could I say about the present of higher education? And as I was thinking about that and talking to all my peers, I think, what an exciting moment for universities. And why is that? I think about this exhibit that we are celebrating today, Selma 1965, Bruce Davidson and the photography, oh my God, I cannot even speak, of civil rights. And as I think about this, why do I think it's such a representation of the energy that I see and feel at university settings like this? It's because it's the combination of many components. It's the combination of art with peace and justice. It's the combination of a curator who's one of our most beloved professors and bringing his students to not just learn about art and the history of art, but learn also about how art can express events that happen in our history, in our nation, and how do we think about these things, again, not just in terms of events, not just in terms of suffering, but also in terms of the passion, the strategy behind achieving a goal, the strategy behind bringing people together. And there are so many lessons. And how do you do that in a way that moves beyond traditional models of educating next generations of peace builders and change makers? And when I see all the things that happen around this exhibit, like I said, the teaching, the learning, the collaboration, the coming together, the wanting to experience history in so many ways. Again, not just reading a paper, not just watching a documentary, not just seeing a play that is happening next week. It's all of that and much more. So with that, I just want to convey this great moment for higher education, universities, for USD, and especially for us at the Kroc School of Peace Studies. I welcome our guest. I welcome our faculty member and another faculty member and director of galleries, university galleries, Derek Cartwright, and of course, all of you, because without you, none of this energy would really be boiling. And I hope you feel it. Do you feel it, or is it just me? The Venezuelan from the tropics always like going like this. It is there, correct? Yes, let's change the world, and let's use all we have around us to do it. So with that, I welcome you, and thank you very much for being with us tonight. Derek?
So I don't like following Patricia to the podium. She's got such fantastic energy, and it's such a challenge to match it when you come up here after that enthusiasm. But I do want to begin by enthusiastically thanking Patricia and her colleagues at the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies. This has been a partnership with them. And every step of the way, I've considered the projects that take place in these galleries to be the most fitting partnership that we can manage between such excellent colleagues in the Kroc School and the university galleries as we try to make this as lively a place as possible. And I want to thank you again for your leadership in that. In truth, this exhibition has been a team effort beyond just the work that we've been able to do with the Kroc School. It draws on the support of so many here at USD, and some are here, like my colleagues from the library who offered to help put this together, and deans throughout the university And so I want to add my thanks to Patricia's, to all of you for being here this evening, especially my two colleagues, Erin Maines and Catherine Powers. We're a lean team, but they've made this happen. So I wondered if you could join me in a round of applause for them. In addition to being a collaboration, this is also an experiment. For me, it's really important to involve the students at USD in the kind of work that the galleries are producing, and that's not happening at most university campuses. I think it's difficult to imagine taking people at the beginning of their academic careers and inserting them right away into an important teaching exhibition, but we've been fearless about that, and all the didactics in the exhibition were written by students in the course that I taught last semester called The Histories and Theories of Photography. And so if you'll bear with me, I wonder if we couldn't offer those of them that are here our applause as well. But as Patricia said more enthusiastically than I can manage at this hour, really we're doing this for you. And we want you to be part of the programming and to feel engaged with the efforts of this university in the most positive ways. And I hope that you'll let me know what you think of this project and that you'll come back for others in the future, because we're really just getting started with developing the most dynamic photography programs for these galleries that we can imagine. Stuart Hall, the late and I think very great British theorist of resistance, once wrote, "A damaging system of representation can only be dismantled not by a sudden dose of the real, but by another alternative form of representation whose form better approximates the complexity of real solutions it seeks to explore and contest." It strikes me that maybe Hall's formulation can be a little bit helpful to us in thinking through the issues we raised tonight about the relationship between photography and civil rights in the United States. How else can we explain the repugnance we now feel toward the physical evidence of segregated schools, discriminatory poll taxes and literacy tests, separate drinking fountains, and other more subtle manifestations of Jim Crow not so terribly long ago, and the ways that photography served to make those things visible and ultimately intolerable to our eyes? I'm suggesting that we think of the civil rights imagery by Davidson and many others not just as a dose of the real, but as an alternative and compelling view of historical events as they unfolded around 1965, a committed response, if you will, that effectively supplanted racism by offering a more thorough account of moral courage, an alternative model of individual dignity and group resistance. Selma 1965 offers us an opportunity to reflect on that model and to relate it to the circumstances that we still experience today. For me, that's reason enough to do this show. But my real role tonight is not to give you a lecture, although I started to, I'm sorry. My role tonight is to introduce our truly distinguished experts who will really pleased me by so graciously agreeing to be here and let us eavesdrop on their conversation about civil rights and photography. We could not ask for better people to conduct this dialogue. I'll start by introducing Jesse Mills, my terrific colleague, who probably requires no introduction on this campus, but I will anyway. Jesse is an associate professor and chair of USD's Ethnic Studies Department. He received his BA in philosophy at Sonoma State, 2 master's degrees from UCLA and UCSD in Afro-American Studies and Ethnic Studies, respectively, and his PhD in Ethnic Studies from UCSD. Jesse is an advisor to the Black Student Union and to San Diego's Somali Family Services and a strategist for the United Taxi Workers of San Diego. He's an artist and a musician, but is best known here at USD for his extremely popular courses on African American civil rights, African American music and culture, race and performance, and comparative migration. So join me in a round of applause for Jesse. I'm also so pleased that Julian Cox could be here. Since 2010, Julian has been the founding curator of photography and also the chief curator at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. He was educated in Great Britain, holds a BA in art history from the University of Manchester, and a Master's of Philosophy degree in the history of photography at the University College of Wales. Julian has enviably broad curatorial experiences at the National Library of Wales, at the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television in Bradford, England, and for 10 years he worked in the J. Paul Getty's Department of Photography. After that, working for another 5 years as chief curator of photography at the High Museum of Art before joining the team in San Francisco. In Atlanta, Georgia, at the High, he curated Road to Freedom, photographs of the civil rights movement, among many other major exhibitions. And if you haven't consulted the catalog that Julian wrote for that exhibition, you really must. It's one of the most compelling documents about this era. Most recently, Julian organized Keith Haring, The Political Line, which closed at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco in February of this year. Consisting of more than 140 works drawn from more than 40 public and private collections held in the United States and internationally. This was the first, it's hard to believe, it's the first major exhibition to examine Keith Haring's career and looking at it through the lens of social, political, and cultural issues that preoccupied him during his short but remarkably productive life. Cox is presently working on a retrospective of the photographs and films of Danny Lyon, which will open next summer at the Whitney Museum of American Art. So I'm so looking forward to this dialogue, as I'm sure you are, so I'll step aside and let's listen to Julian and Jesse.
Derek, Patricia, thank you so much for the warm welcome, the generous introduction. It's just such an honor. Thank you all for being here to share in this momentous moment for our campus, for our community, to have this retrospective, to have the honor of our distinguished guest to help us understand just why what we're doing here is actually so important and what impact that can have on us. Julian, would you like to, I mean, it's just so great to meet you, to have you here. Enviable experience is definitely an understatement, and from my viewpoint, it's I'm just absolutely thrilled to hear about all that you've done, and maybe you can just give us a sense of, coming into this, what some of your experiences have been, why the importance of civil rights photography specifically, and why the importance of having the Selma 1965 exhibit here at USD.
Of course, it'd be a pleasure to do that, Jesse. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming in from the beautiful outside, Southern California, to spend time with us under the lights here. I'm just delighted to be here. Thank you, Derek, for inviting me, and Patricia for hosting us, and for you to give up some time this evening to listen to our dialogue. This is the exhibition, by the way, is fabulous. I tip my hat to the students who worked so hard to put it together. I mean, it's really very well done. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. This is a subject that is of great personal interest to me, it has great meaning for me. You heard in Derek's introduction a little bit about my biography. I spent 5 years in Atlanta, Georgia, and that's where I became engaged with this history. I'm born and raised in Great Britain. The history of the civil rights movement is barely touched upon in public schools there, or state schools as we call them. So I didn't really know much about this history before I moved to this country in the early 90s. But when I took this job in Atlanta, Georgia, it was in the air in every sense of what that means. And I started to become engaged with this history in a very powerful way, in a way that really, I would say, changed my life. I mean, I don't want to sort of overstate it, but and one of the reasons why that happened is because I had the privilege of meeting many of the people who made this history. The leaders who are very prominent in that history, people like Congressman John Lewis, Andrew Young, the Reverend C.T. Vivian, Julian Bond, the list goes on. These are people who still live in Atlanta, still part of that community, still engaged in the very same issues. Many of you, I'm sure, saw Congressman Lewis holding the hand of our president, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge last weekend, the 50th anniversary of the first Selma March. So meeting those people, makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. So for me, as someone who is still after 20 years living in this country, trying to engage with this country and understand its history, this was a very powerful passage in my life to spend this time in Atlanta. And my profession is to be a historian of photography and a curator of photography. So I wanted to explore this and find a way to understand the way that this history was recorded through the medium of photography. And of course, how history gets written is a complicated issue. You all know that and understand that. But I wanted to try to grapple with it. And ostensibly for that museum, the High Museum of Art, create an archive of fine art museum quality photographs. And we can talk more about what that actually means in due course. But I set about creating an archive, acquiring pictures for that museum from a medley of living photographers. So that's another very key piece of this, that I've mentioned the activists, the leaders that made this history that we all benefit from today. But I had, through my profession, a chance to engage with photographers who, regardless of their different background and the way they fit in the universe of photography, which is a complex thing, every one of those people cared about that history. They were making the pictures for a very good reason. So one cannot help but be moved by that and inspired to try to understand the history better, and in some modest way add to it, or well, it's not add to it, but in some modest way help to evaluate it and represent it to a contemporary audience. And the trigger for me back in Atlanta was 2008 was the 40th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, and that is his community, and that was the reason why I did the project then. Now we're celebrating, if that's the right word, the 50th anniversary of the Selma March, and you know, there's another very powerful, resonant moment in our culture where we're sort of revisiting that history, trying to understand it better, and to hopefully see it in new kinds of ways. And photography is a way of seeing the world, of course, of recording the world, a way of making some sense of the world. And so that's what the pictures that you see behind us here, I don't know if we can actually put them on, move the slides independently, but we're going to be showing behind us some slides. We'll this one? Will this automatically move them, or shall I just move them myself? So I'm going to automatically move. So as I flick through here, these are images that some of them are in the exhibition that's been prepared here, and others are in the history books, in the archives around the country. But as we get further into it, we can discuss different kinds of issues that these pictures present to us, and the kinds of meanings that they have. Some of you might have noticed that the New York Times, I mean, they published a story on the march, of course, this weekend, and there was commentary in one of the British newspapers about the fact that George Bush was excluded, was cropped out of the picture, because he was there, he was on stage with the president and the other leaders there, but he was not reproduced on the front page of the New York Times. And you know, various conservative pundits here remarked on that, and it's, you know, it's a story now that's covered the globe, and it's interesting how that same issue of editing and cropping and editorializing is, you know, lies at the heart of photography, especially when it comes to photographs that were, in most instances, made to be reproduced. Not all instances, but most of the works that document the civil rights movement were made to be reproduced. They were made to be disseminated. The leadership of the various different civil rights organizations, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, Dr. King's organization, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the CORE, it goes on and on. Each of these groups understood the power of the media, the power of the photograph to tell their story, to help raise funds so they can continue their activism, their nonviolent direct action activism throughout primarily the American South. So it cannot be underestimated how important the photographic image is to the way that we understand today the civil rights movement. This is just a pause on this picture for a moment. This is the Selma March that started on the third march, actually. There were a sequence of 3 marches, but this is the third one that started on 21st of March, 1965. And you'll get a little sense here of this cavalcade of vehicles that's following the marchers. And so there are some great pictures that show you, usually in front of the marchers, there was a sort of open back truck that was just packed with photographers, packed with news cameramen photographing and filming the march. And in this exhibition, you have the privilege, and I would call it that, of seeing the work of Bruce Davidson, who was one of the very talented younger photographers who was on that march. But there is a long list of names of very talented, very accomplished photographers who were there right alongside him, who have a parallel but different in subtle ways story to tell of this same march. It needs to be said that this march is a media moment. It's a sort of really a climax of obviously the work that was done by the leadership and the many folks in the trenches to try to get the voting rights bill through, and countless different legal actions across the South, especially in states like Mississippi, out in Alabama, Louisiana, and so forth. But this is the moment when the nation is paying the most attention, when obviously the President, Johnson, is in a very extreme dilemma to how to deal with it. And if those of you who've seen the movie Selma get some sense of that, a kind of paraphrased version of it. But I think it does a pretty good job of outlining the main tensions there. But this statement I'm making about this being a media event is very important to keep in mind when you look at these pictures, because of course, it's rather a cliche, but a photograph is a tiny slice of the world, right? That's been framed and created by the photographer for a very specific reason. And in the case of Bruce Davidson, he was making these pictures to try to create a living for himself. He wasn't only doing it because he cared about the story. He did care about it. It would be incorrect of me to say otherwise, but he also was trying to sell his pictures like everybody else was, and to create a name for himself. And the experience of working throughout the South, he covered the Freedom Rides, as I'm sure you know. There are a couple of wonderful pictures in the show that deal with that particular piece of the civil rights story. But this is the sort of moment of explosion when this is a global issue because of the way that the media had dealt with this. Of course, the first big moment really is probably Birmingham in May of 1963, and the events that occurred there when those pictures were published on the front page of the New York Times on May 4th, and then Kennedy had to really deal with it then, and then it was Johnson's turn 2 years later with the Selma March. But this is the civil rights story is a mass media story, and there's an interesting, one of the things I try to deal with in the way I put the collection together in Atlanta, and the way I deal with this is to try to find a layered representation of this movement and what it means. And scenes like this is a Bruce Davidson photograph, but a fabulous picture where he's showing you the educational environment of African-American children in the state of Lowndes County in Alabama, where there was just not a single African-American person registered to vote till that march happened. So this is a different kind of picture that it doesn't have the drama and the kind of high emotion of some of the March pictures, but it's a very important document and window into a part of American history that really wasn't seen, and certainly was not seen in the mainstream white-dominated press. And there's another whole thing we need to get into when we talk about the press, because there's a big difference between the black press and the white press, especially at this time. These are other pictures that Bruce Davidson made that are not necessarily, they're from a project he did called Time of Change, pictures he made between 1961 and 65, when, and not necessarily all in the South. Some of them were made in New York, which was his primary place of residence, his home, and he would go back and forward from New York down to the South, and this is a very sort of carefully made edit of some of the kinds of pictures that he made. But really, he had made the Brooklyn Gang series before this in 1959, I think it was, and then a really great series of circus pictures in 58. But he hadn't really turned his attention to what you would call the social fabric with political content. And once he really trained his lens on the civil rights issue, his photography changed and would never really be the same again as a consequence. This is a good example of a picture that he makes. It's a great picture, obviously, especially with the background elements, but this is a picture from New York. It's not a picture from the South. And so you need to, if you have a label underneath the picture, then you know where it's from, but this could easily be mistaken for a picture that was made in the South, but it's not. It's made in the North, and there's a very big difference in the kind of social reality of African Americans in the North versus the South at this time. So this is where the kind of good work that the students have done here on the exhibition to provide these excellent didactic texts and a sort of framework, a context for these pictures is really very important. Of course, as someone that loves photography, you can look at a picture like this and enjoy it on many different levels, but it is a picture that is made, because of the content. It's not made for aesthetic reasons. It's made because of the message that's invoked there. Yeah.
If I might invite you while you're walking us through the sequence. So for me, I'm very interested in your understanding and your sense of the art side of the curatorial role, right? So in your introduction, it was really exciting to hear you narrating your work in Atlanta, and I think one of the key aspects of that to me is, it really showed me that you're a part of this movement, right? So you're a part of it because you're connected directly to the living legacy, and you're actually one of those who is gathering and presenting our visual, our historical texts. So maybe as you're going through these, if you could just give us a sense of how you view your role in the movement, right? Because because you're helping us to understand what it was through the imagery. So,
well, I'm in a way flattered by how you characterize it, but I can't see it that way for myself. The way I see it, so here's a picture that we're looking at now that is sort of the epitome of obviously there's a kind of story here we don't know just looking at it in abstract, but it illustrates, if that's the right word, the non-violent training that a lot of these young activists went through, and that is the linchpin of the movement that Dr. King led. And of course, he is the sort of hero figure in this narrative, but there are many other players in that story, and a movie like Selma sort of tends to really minimize the role that some of these other activists played. For example, Diane Nash, who is a very key figure, as you know, and one of the most thoroughly trained and practiced and conversant nonviolent tacticians, you know, in the history of the movement, period. You know, she was trained in Tennessee, in Nashville, which was really the major hub of nonviolent training in this country. She studied there with, alongside people like Congressman John Lewis, from the Reverend James Lawson, who was taught directly by Gandhi, went to Indian training with Gandhi. So, and she, just as a kind of footnote here, refused to cross the Selma Bridge on Sunday. Probably some of you know that, because she took exception to the involvement of certain political figures who she felt were the absolute embodiment of violence in terms of their policies. So, you know, what's so powerful about this photography for me is the kind of narratives or the subtext that most of the pictures contain. So this is a picture, if I'm not mistaken, of Andrew Young, who's was you know, one of King's right-hand men, and a very key part of the nonviolent strategy. And there, by King's side at every one of the major flashpoints of the movement, and was sort of very much involved in that. So for me, it's, you know, each one of these pictures in different ways is a kind of unraveling, you know, an unraveling of an issue. In this case, you have, you know, I'm not conversant in this instance of exactly where this is, but clearly it's a mother and a daughter getting more information, finding out more information about perhaps how to register to vote or housing opportunities, that kind of thing. It's a community picture. It's a picture about community life and involvement. And this is the kind of picture that really doesn't find its way into mainstream publications, because it's not, as I was saying earlier on, it's not really that dramatic. You know, it's kind of life going on as normal, but it is part of the you know, part of the process. And this is a similarly wonderful picture for me, because it kind of signals the exhaustion of the kind of commitment that these young people had to discussing the issues with each other, to banding together to try to find a solution, and to going through the formal training that they had. And these are people who are the age of, you know, many of you young students sitting in this auditorium, 20, 21, 22 years of age, and learning with each other the techniques of nonviolence, learning about the way of trying to sort of convert violence and aggression into constructive passivity. This is a Freedom Ride picture, very, very rare picture that is all about the sort of tactical, strategic nous of the photographer to make a picture. So he's inside the bus on one of the early Freedom Rides. This is actually, it's very significant, because this picture is made after the firebombing of one of the Freedom Ride buses in Anniston, Alabama, which happened on Mother's Day, May 14th of 1961. And so you see this cavalcade, this sort of armed guard of police cars there out of the window. And so it's a very intelligent picture, because Davidson is signaling the increased police presence that was necessary so that these young people did not lose their lives. Miraculously, nobody was killed on that day in Anniston, but by rights they should have been, based on what they went through. But this is a great example of you know, what I would call, you sort of referring to this, Jesse, a very artistic, a very artful, a beautiful, intelligent picture where you can, this woman who has her hand on her face, she's probably singing a freedom song, or kind of, you know, she's humming or singing to herself, and as a way to give herself strength. Meanwhile, there's this cavalcade of police on the other side. I'm going to shut up in a second.
Yeah.
I just want to say one last thing. I had the privilege of meeting a man called Hank Thomas, who was a young steward at Howard University, who was on that freedom ride on the bus when it got bombed. And he lives in Atlanta and is a very successful businessman now, and an extraordinary person. And he was the one who sort of kind of saved the people on that bus. I mean, he doesn't say it that way himself, but he's the one that got them off the bus without harm to their lives. And so, in a way, long-windedly coming back to your question, Jesse, that when someone like me has an opportunity to meet someone like that, I feel a responsibility in some modest way to try to bring this work, the photographs into a public setting to be presented and potentially understood in a new way.
I'd love to hear more story about that moment where you're meeting with a photographer, where you're learning about images. That's this knowledge base that you're putting together into what ends up curated. Do you have other stories of working with photographers, perhaps from Atlanta? You had mentioned some. That can just help give us a sense of what you experienced in finding, compiling into the High Museum, and then curating.
Sure. I mean, I think that there's some, quite a few stories with photographers, but actually the most interesting ones for me were with activists and journalists. So a quick one in terms of an activist would be a man called Jimmy Travis, who was a field worker for SNCC, who I met in Neshoba County, Mississippi. Every year on June 21st, there's a memorial for the 3 young men that died that summer, Freedom Summer of June 21st of '64. And so as part of my sort of field research, I went down there to meet some of these people and try to understand why they went back to that place every year to gather and to remember and to commemorate these 3 young men that were killed. And I met a man there called Jimmy Travis who was shot through the neck by the Ku Klux Klan outside of Clarksdale, Mississippi. And I was standing in the field there with him, with a friend. We were making a film. We created a documentary as well as doing the exhibition. And he was sitting there with his denim kind of SNCC field workers uniform, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And when you have a man who is 75 years of age, who's been shot through the back of the neck, telling you that story and without flinching, and that was just something he had to go through in order to try to make change that we all benefit from today. That's the kind of thing that where you just sort of, your spine is just chilled. Changing tack slightly, a woman called Katherine Jackson, who was the first female reporter in the Associated Press newsroom in Atlanta, Georgia. She, by her, because she was the first woman in that kind of role, she's about 5'2", but she covered the civil rights story in a really important way for the Associated Press in Atlanta. And she traveled a lot with a man called Horace Court, who was a field photographer for the Associated Press, working in the Southeast United States. And there were a few times when the two of them kind of saved each other's lives, when they were both in serious danger of being brutally beaten. I mean, she was actually beaten a couple of times, but they could have lost their life, and they saved each other a few times. Especially one instance when she was actually in a phone box, I think it was in Montgomery, telephoning her story into the regional office in Atlanta, and a mob, a kind of white racist mob, smashed the box around her as she was on the phone because they didn't want her to be, reporting the story. And they used that phrase, excuse me, nigger lover. That kind of abuse was what she was subjected to all the time. But she felt a responsibility to tell the story. So. So learning from those kinds of people was especially meaningful to me, because in a way it was outside my comfort zone. With photographers, I deal with them all the time, and it's mostly a question of going through their archives and finding really compelling pictures, trying to bring things forward into the public domain that haven't really been seen before. And actually this show they've done a wonderful job with this exhibition of including a few individual prints that you don't see very often. And so that's part of what I try to do as a curator in any context, but especially in this story, to try to bring out images that aren't typically seen.
So I look at some of what jumps out to me from these images. Clearly the black and white media, the contrast is definitely rich with kind of textual depth and symbolism. I see in a lot of these, in the last sequence of a few photos, for example, there's a contrast in, for example, the role of the police, for example, right? So in some cases you see things that don't make a certain kind of cognitive sense, like officers detaining a dignified and calm woman who doesn't appear to be a threat. And then in another moment you see officers protecting a bus from perhaps terrorist violence. And then in a text like this, you have all of these interesting contrasts of these kind of like curved lines of the human body, the straight lines of the bars, the straight lines of the ties. You just see like, and then like this inside the car. In this case, it's interesting. It's like, well, what's that dividing line for? Is that like gender propriety? Like we're gonna have the dignity to allow women to not be thrown into the same tank, as the men. And so that's a contrast, right? Because there's like, we're gonna honor gender propriety while we're simultaneously basically locking up and throwing into the darkness folks who are.
It's a wonderful observation, Jesse. And then there's a policeman here holding a poster that says, "Khrushchev can eat here, why can't we?" And this is important because this woman is being arrested for trying to have a meal at the lunch counter at a delicatessen in Birmingham called Loveman's, which was a Jewish-run delicatessen in that city. And Bruce Davidson made a few different pictures of her, actually, of this arrest. And also another photographer called Bob Adelman did as well. So that in and of itself is an interesting phenomenon that I came across a lot of the times, where you have photographers who are literally shoulder to shoulder, and they're photographing the same scene in a very slightly different way. And just moving that extra few inches, the width of the human face, can give you a totally different picture. And if you really get deep into it, you start to see very interesting variations and kind of subtext and the layering that you just unpacked for us really nicely there, Jesse. That occurs again and again when you are in certain moments that are what I would call high media moments, situations where there's a lot of people taking pictures. This is in 1963, so it's when the children are marching, across the Kelly Ingram Square, and from the Baptist Church through the city and being thrown in jail. So there's a lot of media activity there taking place. There's another very interesting picture of this very same woman smiling at the camera, like with a big grin on her face. So we don't have it in this particular selection, but it changes the meaning of this situation a little bit. She's saying, she's got a prideful look on her face because she has been involved. She's involved. She is standing up for her right to be able to eat at the lunch counter. And she doesn't mind going to jail for it. She's going to do it. And she's going to have a smile on her face, which is, the sort of tactic that she feels that she needs to adopt in order to get through it. So, this is sort of where and how photography becomes very interesting, because it does, if you look carefully, it does capture these kinds of nuances. But there's also a flip side to that, because there's a picture like this where you see I think you use this adjective, the sort of calm or the sort of passive arrest is also there's an issue there because it for the predominantly white consuming press, it's a non-threatening image of African Americans, right? So, there's another side to the story. There are other kinds of images too, and without generalizing too much, most of what we see at this memorializing moment now is that sort of mainstream view of the civil rights. It's not, there's a lot of other kinds of pictures that tell you a different side of the story.
Well, let's continue that line of thinking, because to me that's really profound. You talked about photographs as these slices of worlds, slices of a universe. We also, I'd like to hear you talk about the power of the historical knowledge that comes from the photography. So kind of what I'm looking at here is it's another one of these tensions or contradictions that I'm thinking of. So on the one hand, you've got this mainstream kind of mediatized heroic narrative that I think it's very good for hooks, right? It's good for a movie, it's good for an iconic image, it's good for a landmark legislation, it's good for like a particular viewpoint. And that's clearly, as you're saying, it's in tension with the concept of a movement, right? Clearly, the movement spanned the decades and spanned the thousands and hundreds of thousands of people involved beyond that. So, what are the most powerful historical lessons? If we have that kind of, I'll use a term that we would like to use in ethnic studies. If you have that kind of reduction to slices, right? What are the most powerful historical lessons and powerful moral insights that we can gather from this memorializing, media-heavy, mediatized, mainstream-oriented depiction of civil rights movement?
I don't know. I think maybe it's I mean, if you look at this picture by Declan Holm, maybe it's the dignity of simple dignity of standing up for what you think is right, and acting accordingly. But I mean, much of the work that I have done has sort of focused on the nonviolent movement. But if we start talking about a character like Stokely Carmichael, the whole thrust of this conversation goes in a different direction. You know this better than I do. He's a very, very, there's someone who from, the age that he was, 18 onwards, was probably the most committed activist in the movement. But there's a certain point pretty quickly around 1965, 66, where his notion of resistance is much more aggressive, much more about taking up arms and a different kind of solution. So most of what we're seeing in this exhibition here, and really in a picture like this is Julian Bond, who was the head of the press, in charge of all sort of press relationships for SNCC, and a wonderful person, still very active today. And here he is leading mostly college kids from Morehouse and Spelman. This is a picture made in Atlanta, but you see the kind of the sort of symbol of their of them being mobilized and organized. But I think that the message that you get from these pictures is the sort of dignity of coherent tactical protest. I mean, that's what I take from it. That's the sort of top level, but there's obviously more to it than that. Just very quickly, this sort of trilogy of pictures. You have these men sitting on the wall, and we march together: Catholic, Jews, Protestant. Very significant. This exhibition shows you nuns and ministers from all over the country that came to Alabama to march with Dr. King and the other leaders, but also the Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath and Rabbi Abraham Heschel, two of the leading rabbis in the country, came to came to Alabama to show their support. So this is a very powerful public moment in this nation's history when figures, spiritual leaders of that sort of heft and prominence joined together. And I mean, of course, that was one of Dr. King's great talents, was to engender that sort of support in his peers. But when it became so public, and when it was run on CBS News and in Time and Life, it took it to another level. This is in Memphis, actually about a month after Dr. King dies, the sanitation workers strike. It's a photograph made by Ernest Withers, who was, most of the photographers that we've been talking about thus far are white. Ernest Withers was African American, he was from Memphis. And, he was there in the courtroom when the trial for Emmett Till's killer was happening in Mississippi, and he traveled extensively with a journalist called Moses Newson, an African-American journalist who was one of the most preeminent journalists in the country at that time. So, Ernest Withers takes us into different kind of territory. He's someone that's working for the black press. He's working for the Tri-State Defender in Memphis. He's working for the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper. That's his client, and so his work is telling a different kind of story. And this is the way that workers are kind of in one way responding to their need for rights. A few weeks after Dr. King died, or was killed, I should say, in Memphis. Yeah, it's a powerful picture with muskets there. It's not dissimilar to the pictures that were made in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, when the Little Rock Nine were trying to desegregate the Central High School. So, but in a picture like this, the bearded white guy, 2 figures back, is he's important. I mean, he's sort of the fulcrum of this picture from a compositional point of view, and that's the photographer's making a point by framing it that way, obviously. This is the Dallas County Courthouse. There's a scene, and how many in this room saw the Selma movie? So quite a few of you, yeah. So these are the very steps that you see. There's the moment when Oprah and is one of the actors who's sort of attacked in front of the steps, and Sheriff Jim Clark, who is the sheriff of Dallas County, which is just outside of Selma. This is the steps of the courthouse there. So they did their research very carefully for that movie in terms of how they framed things.
Each time I go back to viewing the photography, I get these kind of eerie, like distance yet proximity kind of feelings and experiences. So what I mean by that is I can easily see myself and others looking at these images and really feeling a historical distance, like really feeling a 50-year difference, right? So, for example, the voting rights struggle itself, as you helped us understand the situation, that you would have entire counties where not a single African American was registered to vote, and it was intended. The system in the southern states and southern counties was intended to run in that way. So, the move to get a Voting Rights Act to push for the franchise, not in principle but in practice, was really a very direct blow at an existing system, because you could in fact change the representational structure, and you would dramatically upset certainly the more violent potential that the system could kind of justify itself in meting out against American citizens. So that to me feels like a historical moment that we're not that well in touch with now, right? Because there's this kind of sense of like, it's more like people that don't vote are viewed as apathetic, or like they're just people that for personal reasons they don't kind of get involved in and so it's about entertaining them or making them think that it's cool and kind of using a personal choice appeal to get people to vote more. So that's a little bit of the distancing piece. The proximity piece is like, wow, like a lot of the slogans, a lot of the the poor people's campaigns, a lot of the the I am a man, and as kind of reductive as that is, you even have even more elaborate kind of forms of that. Like in Black Lives Matter, you have a much more elaborated form of that kind of exact same statement being made today. So it's an eerie proximity to me, because it's like, wow, like we in many ways haven't advanced at all since 1965, 50 years, because you still have voter disenfranchisement, and some of that is calculated, and it's like a campaign tactic in order to secure certain kinds of voter blocks, but you still have, kind of at the end of the day, the disparities around participation in the political process, around access to things like jobs, good education, very same kind of slogans, platforms that you'd see here. So I'm not sure if your experience kind of working with the material as well as being embedded in the communities has given you any insight on that kind of a dynamic. So how do you see people not just taking the kind of memorialized viewpoint of this, which is very celebratory of a very important apex moment of a media kind of oriented movement, and simply concluding from that, like, wow, like I'm so glad we're no longer there. I'm so glad that we don't have to address those issues anymore. To see that there's still work yet undone. I'm curious if you've had any insight or thoughts about that through your many experiences.
It's a complicated question, really, for me to really grapple with, and it's also tricky because I'm an outsider. I'm not I'm not a native. I've had a sort of just that the relationship I've had with myself around this history is quite complex for me, actually, because I've tried to grapple with a lot of these issues that you're talking about, but at a certain point I don't feel I feel like I have to kind of just put the shutter down and not go any further, because it's the sort of intensity level, or the power of it and the implications, and that's sort of what's behind your question. I think there's the implications of this history are so momentous that it's almost too much to deal with for me. So as you were talking just a moment ago, I was glancing at this picture, and I don't want to get too off the subject, but let me just say it, because it was taking me back to this notion in my own head of the difference between the role of leadership and then the folks who are in the trenches, the other 25,000, 2,400, 590, whatever, 490 that were on that march, that aren't called Dr. King or Hosea Williams, who's standing next to John Lewis here, but this guy right behind here with the drainpipe trousers, his name is Bob Mance, and I had the privilege of meeting him. He's just passed away about a year ago now, but I had the privilege of talking to him. When John Lewis will recount this story, as he did, last Sunday, of what it was like for him to be on that bridge, and you all know he was beaten very badly that day. But talking to Bob Mance about his experience just sort of gave me another sort of way into that sort of media moment, which is, became global, let's face it. It was everywhere. It was on the CBS News, and it became an international thing. So talking to someone like Bob, who still lives in Lowndes County and, has a sort of, low income, a difficult life. He's not one of the civil rights heroes, but he's stayed in that county, in Lowndes County, and committed his life to trying to improve the lot of the citizens of Lowndes County. And so, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but the only point I'm trying to make is that it's difficult when you talk to someone like that to sort of really, apart from hopefully feeling some kind of responsibility to do justice to the material that you're dealing with, it makes you aware of how the history that we're all absorbing, consuming is just that teeny tiny tip of the iceberg. There's all these different narratives underneath that are as unique and as varied in their own way. And I overheard, forgive me for pointing someone out, but this gentleman here, I think, who was on the march. I think I heard that earlier on. So, I mean, what is this gentleman's story? What's his experience of being on that march? I mean, here I am sitting on this stage, we are, talking about this march. There's a gentleman who was on the march, so, you know, maybe he should talk. Sorry, so I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I was just trying to make a point with it. So.
One of the interesting things to me, I'll give it a try. One of the very interesting things to me is how important these photographs are for me. I flew down to Alabama from Chicago when I was a teacher in Lake Forest with the Catholic Interracial Council on the day before, on the 24th of March. And we spent the night in the mud, getting ready to march in the next day. And I had didn't meet Dr. King, but I've been come under his sway 2 years earlier when I was the chief of staff of a United States congressman in Washington. And went to the march and heard him speak. But the thing is that in both these cases, both of the March on Washington and the March to Montgomery, I find that my memory of 50 years ago is lacking in lots of ways. And these photographs can fill in blanks for me and help me see and remember what really went on that time. And because for instance, they're on the left, that's the next morning where everybody's packing up off in St. Jude's schoolyard there, get ready to march in behind Dr. King. And the relationship between the photographs and my sense of the past is so intimate that now, I mean, those words of Dr. King, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. I was in that crowd with hundreds of thousands of people, but I don't remember those words in person, but by now they've become etched in my memory. The same way here, following Dr. King into Montgomery that next day, on the 25th of March, and hearing him say, how long, not long. I was way back in the crowd, but I could hear that over the speakers, and those are etched in my mind, just as these scenes are etched in my mind now. But I'm not sure how much is my own memory and how much is the photographic memory that makes it come alive for me, and that makes it very important to me in particular. Well, let me just add one thing. It's very easy to go down there in a plane from Chicago and spend a couple of days and then come back to Chicago and back to your life. Whereas the gentleman you just talked about, Mr. Vance, who's been there all these years and living there and fighting the good fight, while the rest of us are going home in our safe roosts in Chicago. There's a real difference there.
Television. Arguably, it was television news footage, not still photographs, that not mobilized, that's the wrong word, that introduced most of America that had never seen this before to the reality. But there's not really a curatorial use of television news footage, is there? It doesn't lend itself to this kind of display. So what do you think about that?
I think it's a good observation. You know, one of the strongest parts of the Selma movie is the footage at the very end. You know, the CBS footage that really takes you back to that moment. You know, as I think I sort of alluded to earlier on, it's really this moment that we're talking about now, Selma, and the disturbances in Birmingham in the spring of '63. Those are the two main moments that are recorded through news cameras because they were very stage managed by the movement leaders. 95% of the atrocities that occurred were not covered by the news media. So it's very sort of isolated, but the footage is extremely powerful. In the case of the exhibition I organized, I decided not to include that footage in the show, but I addressed, the issues around it a little bit in the catalog, and then I created with a friend of mine a 20-minute documentary film that has the testimony of some of the people I've been talking about who I met, and also some still footage of people like George Wallace and Governor Patterson in Mississippi talking about segregation and the issues. So, but your point is a good one, that the rise of TV culture at this time is significant. It's important to say, however, that in the poorest counties of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, most African Americans did not have access to televisions. So it's sort of a very monolithic view of America that's being shown that way. And it's interesting, that in the wonderful vitrine, the little case that the students put together here, they have some magazines, that show how these photographs were reproduced. You'll notice that the jet from that period can slip in your pocket. It's a pocket-sized way of consuming the news, so it's more portable, it's more kind of everyday. It's almost like a kind of notebook or a prayer book or something. You can pull it out of your pocket and read it. It's not like a folio newspaper. So, and Life magazine, Look, all these different magazines were their circulations were very significant during this period. So there were different ways to absorb media culture, whether it's the moving image or the still image.
I just wanted to add briefly to that, in addition to what you mentioned, you had riots at this time, rebellions or riots in more than 200 cities. So there was a very direct experience that a lot of people were getting throughout the nation of there were sit-ins throughout the South, there were rebellions throughout the nation. So you actually had a very layered kind of ability to experience the movement. You could see it on television, you could read it in print news with photos, you could actually see it happening somewhere nearby you as well. So that would be important to kind of highlight as well.